Hej och välkomna tillbaka till Erik Penser Banks bolagsdag. Nu har det blivit dags för Calliditas Therapeutics och CMO Richard Philipson. Och the presentation will be in English. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Philipson. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Calliditas. And I'm here to tell you some more about the company and its product and its pipeline. So just draw your attention to our disclaimers. So Calliditas is a small specialty pharmaceutical company. We are developing and commercializing treatments for rare diseases with significant unmet medical needs. We have a commercial asset, Tarpeyo, in the US, the same product, it's called Kinpeygo in Europe, and this is the first product that's been approved for the rare kidney disease IgA nephropathy. And we also have a platform developing treatments based around NOX inhibition targeting fibrosis. And we will continue to build the company based around in-licensing or other kind of business development activities. We're headquartered here in Stockholm and we're listed on the Swedish Stock Exchange and on the Nasdaq in the US. And this just summarizes our pipeline and products. So as I've already mentioned, we have a product for the treatment of IgA nephropathy. This is marketed in the US as Tarpeyo and in Europe as Kinpeygo. For our commercialization in Europe, we work with a partner called STADA, which is based in Germany. We also are developing and plan to commercialize the product in the Greater China area, working with a partner in China called Everest Medicines. And more recently, we entered into a collaborative agreement with a company called Viatris to develop and commercialize the product in Japan. And then we also, as I've already mentioned, have a product or development candidate called setanaxib, which is a NOX enzyme inhibitor. And we have phase 2 clinical trials ongoing in diseases, primary biliary cholangitis, a rare liver disease, squamous cell carcinoma of the head and neck, Alport syndrome, which is a rare kidney disease, and we also have a investigator-sponsored trial ongoing in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, a rare lung disease. So a little bit more about IgA nephropathy, which is the disease which our commercialized product, Tarpeyo, has been designed to treat. And this is a rare disease, but probably one of the more common rare diseases. The prevalence in the US, we estimate that there's around about 130 to 150,000 patients with IgA nephropathy in the US, around about 200,000 in Europe. But in the Greater China area and in China, it's actually a more common condition. It's probably related to genetic factors and also environmental factors in that region, which makes the condition more frequent. And we estimate now that there's around about 5 million people with IgA nephropathy in that territory. So as I say, this is a condition where there is a genetic predisposition, but that's not a prerequisite for the condition. There are other environmental factors involved in the precipitation of the condition. It typically presents in early to mid-adulthood. And patients who develop this condition, we think more than 50% of patients are at risk of developing end-stage kidney disease within 10 to 20 years of the diagnosis. So of course that will then lead to them requiring hemodialysis or a kidney transplant. So the aims of treatments that are being developed is to somehow try to preserve the kidney function. And we measure the well-being of the kidneys through measuring proteinuria. And we know that proteinuria levels more than 1 gram per 24 hours, levels of protein in the urine are associated with worse outcomes, and indeed recent published data suggests actually that threshold is lower. Actually, patients with lower levels of proteinuria, around 0.5 gram in 24 hours, we now know from recent published data, they are also at significant risk of developing end-stage kidney disease within 10 to 20 years. So what causes IgA nephropathy? So the predominant theory describes what we call a 4-hit hypothesis. So although the disease manifests in the kidney, it is a kidney disease. The origins of the disease, according to the predominant hypothesis, lie in the gut, the gastrointestinal tract, and more specifically in a part of the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, called the distal ileum, so towards the end of the small intestine. And this is a region where we find concentrations of lymphoid tissue called Peyer's patches. And these Peyer's patches are the source of immunoglobulin A. And this immunoglobulin A is usually restricted to the gastrointestinal tract and is our first line of defense against infection or other antigens. But in this condition, disease, IgA nephropathy, this IgA finds its way into the systemic circulation. And it has a particular property that makes it, elicits an autoimmune response when it does reach the systemic circulation. So patients develop autoantibodies to this IgA that forms what we call immune complexes, which circulate and get deposited in the filtration units of the kidney, the glomeruli, causing an inflammatory response, and over time that inflammation causes damage and loss of the filtration units, the glomeruli, and eventually end-stage kidney disease develops as a consequence of that. So Tarpeyo, as it's called in the US, Kinpeygo in Europe, when we developed this treatment, actually the development name for the product was Nefecon. So Nefecon has been designed to specifically target the Peyer's patches in the distal small intestine to try and reduce the amount of pathological IgA reaching the systemic circulation. And it's been through a full clinical development program, and here you see a snapshot of some of the really important data that came out earlier this year. So we released headline data from our pivotal phase 3 clinical trial in March, and that data has now been published in the Lancet. It was published in August, and what it showed is that over a 2-year period of treatment and observation, so Nefecon is administered for 9 months, and in the clinical trial after that 9-month period, we observed patients for a further 15 months without any treatment, and we saw over that 2-year period of treatment and then observation that, that there was a loss of kidney function of around over 20% in patients in placebo versus an 11% loss of kidney function measured by eGFR in patients receiving Nefecon. So over the 2 years, there was a decline in the estimated glomerular filtration rate of 12 mils per minute over 2 years in patients on placebo versus a loss of 6 mils per minute in patients receiving Nefecon. So that equates to an outcome where Nefecon is, treatment with Nefecon is resulting in 50% less loss of kidney function compared to placebo over the 24-month period. So a clear kidney function preserving effect of the treatment. We also looked at proteinuria over the period of treatment and observation, as this is another important measure of how the kidneys are functioning. And we saw that over the first 9 months, during which patients were receiving treatment, Nefecon reduced the levels of proteinuria, which is a good thing. So there was over 33% reduction in proteinuria in patients receiving Nefecon versus a very small 5% reduction in patients receiving placebo. And what we then observed over the full duration of the study is at 24 months, so after 9 months of treatment and 15 months of observation, that improvement in proteinuria, the reduction in proteinuria in association with Nefecon treatment, had been maintained during that 15-month period of treatment. In terms of the safety profile, generally the treatment is well tolerated. We looked at objective measures of things like body weight and blood pressure. These showed non-clinically relevant changes which were fully reversible on discontinuation of treatment. The most commonly reported adverse events were, compared to placebo, were peripheral edema, hypertension, muscle spasms and acne. Most adverse events were mild or moderate in severity, and importantly, fewer than 10% of patients discontinued treatment due to adverse events related to the study drug. So overall then, we have, through our development program, we have developed a treatment, Nefecon, with the potential to establish a new standard of care in IgA nephropathy. This targets the origins of the disease in the distal ileum. It modulates the activity of B cells, key cells, involved in the production of IgA. This is a treatment that will be given and is given on top of optimized RAS inhibitor therapy, so on top of supportive care treatment that's given to everyone with IgA nephropathy, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers. I think I've shown you that the treatment has an important benefit in terms of preservation of kidney function, indicating a disease-modifying effect, and the adverse event profile, the safety profile, is well characterized. So based on all of these data, we have accelerated approval in the US and conditional approval in Europe, which was achieved towards the end of 2021 in the US and in 2022 in Europe. But we have now, based on the final results of this study, filed for full approval in the US. We submitted that file in June of this year. We were granted priority review, so we expect to hear the outcome of that submission by the 20th of December. And similarly, through our partner STADA, we submitted an application to convert the conditional approval to full approval in Europe, and that was submitted in September. So moving on then, just to give a bit more information about what we're doing to commercialize the product. This is the first approved therapy for IgA nephropathy. As I say, it was approved by the FDA in December 2021, and we started commercializing the product. We launched it in January 2022. And similarly, working with our partner STADA, the product was launched in Germany in September 2022, and it continues to be rolled out in countries in Europe, subject to appropriate pricing review. I've shown you the phase 3 long-term data, and in the US, the product is approved for the reduction of proteinuria in adults with IgA nephropathy at risk of rapid disease progression, generally a urine protein to creatinine ratio of 1.5 grams per gram or higher. We recently released a Q3 update for our progress during the year, and we have demonstrated continued growth and progress executing on our strategy. So the net sales for Tarpeyo for the 9 months to 2023 were $69 million. That was a 3- to 4-fold increase year on year, 256% growth year on year. We had a 50% reduction year over year in terms of cash flow for operating activities, and our cash position was favourable, remains favourable based on our Q3 update. So we're continuing to build on our success. We're growing the commercialization of Tarpeyo in the US, and we have a clear strategy around how we're doing that. Healthcare practitioner education and education is critical. We focus and we conduct extensive education, educating nephrologists in the US relating to the underlying pathogenesis of IgA nephropathy, which I've talked to you about, educating them about the 4-hit hypothesis, and engaging in peer-to-peer interactions. We have a highly developed process for providing the medication in the US relating to access and reimbursement. We have a centralized hub which we call Tarpeyo Touchpoints, and this manages the provision. So this is a centralized method of managing the provision of the treatment to patients in the US. So they don't go to their own pharmacy and get the treatment. This is all managed centrally through a single pharmacy, and we have a number of staff we employ to manage that process, to help the patients, to assist the physicians in ensuring that when the physician writes a prescription in the US for a patient to receive Tarpeyo, that transitions very, very smoothly through the pharmacy, through to the patient getting the medication in their hands. And we also have education and support for patients, really and pharmacists to ensure and help with patients adhering to treatment and supporting positive outcomes with the patients. And we have a very, very strong commercial leadership team in the US, and I think this has resulted in the favourable growth that we've observed through 2022 and through in this year as well. We've really driven the awareness of the condition and the awareness of the treatment in the US in nephrologists, and now over 90% of nephrologists are aware of Tarpeyo as a treatment for IgA nephropathy. We have an experienced sales force that have been on the ground now for over 18 months, and we've expanded the sales force. We now have 70 sales representatives with expertise in nephrology and rare disease and specialty products. And we have over 90% of lives, US lives in the US, covered to allow them to receive treatment with Tarpeyo. So in the few minutes that I have left in the presentation, I'm going to now move on and tell you a little bit more about our NOX enzyme inhibitor development program. You saw in the pipeline earlier that we have our commercial product Tarpeyo that I've told you about, but we also have a pipeline built around a product called setanaxib, which is developed for fibrosing diseases. So what is this all about, these NOX inhibitors? So we know that the enzymes, NOX enzymes, this stands for NADPH oxidase. NOX enzymes are important targets relating to inflammation and fibrosis. These enzymes are involved in the generation of what we call reactive oxygen species, ROS, and these are important molecules involved in cell signaling processes, but at higher concentrations in response to external injury, NOX enzymes become activated. They generate high levels of reactive oxygen species, and this in turn activates multiple different pathways involved in fibrogenesis. And the consequence of this is to convert an important cell called the fibroblast from a resting state to an activated state. And when that fibroblast is activated, it secretes what we call extracellular matrix, which contains collagen fragments, and those collagen fragments cross-link and cause fibrosis. So the external injury activates the enzymes, produces reactive oxygen species, which in turn leads to fibrosis. And this we see in many different organs depending on the stimulus. So we know fibrosis is important in heart disease, lung disease, kidney disease, liver disease, but also in the cancer setting in solid tumours. Solid tumours also express NOx enzymes, and we find fibroblasts in many solid tumours. In that setting, it's called a cancer-associated fibroblast, and that cell can affect a patient's outcomes and also their response to treatments like pembrolizumab. And when we look in more detail at one of those areas, in the oncology area, we've seen some fascinating data. It was generated in an academic setting in the UK. And what we saw in that setting, and you may have heard of a treatment called pembrolizumab, which is very important in the treatment of many different solid tumours. Pembrolizumab depends for its effects on a particular cell called the tumour-infiltrating lymphocyte. We need tumour-infiltrating lymphocytes inside solid tumours in order for pembrolizumab to work. And that cell I told you about a couple of minutes ago, called the cancer-associated fibroblast, that keeps out TILs, so that's a bad thing. And what we've seen in animal experiments is when we give cetuximab with pembrolizumab, it enhances the effect of pembrolizumab. And it does that by turning these active cancer-associated fibroblasts into inactive cells, and tumour-infiltrating lymphocytes get into the tumour, and therefore the pembrolizumab can work more effectively in the animal model setting, and we see that manifest as slowing of tumour growth, improvements in survival, and we see the tumour become infiltrated with tumour-infiltrating lymphocytes. So based on that, we are in the process of executing a phase 2 clinical trial in patients with recurrent and metastatic squamous cell carcinoma of the head and neck. And that study is ongoing, and we expect that study to read out in the first half of next year. However, we built into that study an interim review of the data, and that was conducted in July of this year, and that gave us some very, very encouraging data. So not only did we see some early evidence, albeit in small numbers, not subject to statistical testing in this interim, we saw encouraging numerical differences in how patients were responding to treatment in terms of progression-free survival, favouring patients who are receiving cetuximab, but we also saw in tumour biopsy tissue evidence that cetuximab is modulating important pathways involved in activation of fibroblasts. So we saw this by taking tumour biopsies, doing what we call a transcriptomic analysis. So this is looking at gene expression and looking at gene expression along particular pathways, and we saw modulation of important fibrotic pathways, supporting the mechanism of action of the treatment and potential benefit in this setting. So as I say, we expect to have data from this study in the first half of next year. We're not going to become an oncology company. We're not going to embark on a phase 3 program in head and neck cancer or other solid tumours. We will use that outcome as a basis for partnering discussions. So we have cetuximab, as I say, I've told you about the study in head and neck cancer. We also have a clinical trial, as I mentioned, an ongoing phase 2b clinical trial in primary biliary cholangitis, and we expect that study also to read out in the middle of next year. We have an investigator-sponsored clinical trial in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis that will read out in the second half of next year, and we expect to start a study in a rare kidney disease, Alport syndrome, by the end of this year. So we're nearly at the end of 2023. We have had an exciting journey during this year. We've had great presence at conferences throughout the year at EREDTA, the European Nephrology Conference, IgAN and International IgA Nephropathy Conference in Tokyo, and very recently at the American Society of Nephrology. We're excited to receive the outcome of our application in the US with the PDUFA date in December, on December the 20th of this year, and again excited to see the outcome of our head and neck cancer program in the first half of next year.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Richard, for the presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Yeah. There's no time for questions, so we are done with that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You
Thank you very much.
took the time.
Thank you very much.
Perfect.
So I was looking at that as the
Yeah,
time for the
yeah.